Thank you very much for that introduction, and even more for inviting me here, because I've never been to this university, although I've known one or two members of its faculty. And in fact, I am quite amazed at what a large and diverse and sophisticated university this is. So this is a learning experience for me and not just a teaching experience. The title of my talk today is The Big Bang Theory of Islamic History. That will mean approximately nothing to everyone, because it's a pet theory of mine that has only shown up in one book review so far, but it will play a signal role in the book I am currently writing. And that book is intended to explain the historical and social and institutional roots of military dictatorship or officer rule in the contemporary Muslim world. It'll probably have a title something like Lineages of the Neo-Mamluk State. Neo-Mamluk being another term I'm inventing, but I think it's a little more obvious than the Big Bang Theory. So what in the world does the Big Bang Theory amount to, and how could it relate to a broader political discourse? It's obviously a metaphor borrowed from cosmology, and I'm going to assume that most people are aware of the notion that the universe began, the university did not begin with a big bang, maybe a little bitty bang. But the universe started with a singularity in which everything that could be in the universe was compacted into an unimaginably concentrated and seemingly homogeneous energy source. And then you had a big bang, and you had the inflation of that singularity in a phenomenally rapid fashion that then developed heterogeneous qualities, so that instead of it being a uniform body of energy, it divided into stars and galaxies and planets and so forth and so on. The Big Crunch corollary that was popular some time ago but now seems to have lost much of its appeal was based on the idea that the force of gravity ultimately would cause the expansion of that singularity to reverse and become a contraction, and that all of the energy in the universe would be sucked back into a new singularity. So in other words, you have a singularity, then you have the inflation, and then with a big crunch it comes back and you get a new singularity, and then conceivably a second Big Bang for the next iteration of a seemingly infinite extent of universes. The way I'm using this metaphor is to say that when you try to put Islamic history together from a whole 14 centuries, you find an interesting phenomenon, that you have periods of inflation and heterogeneity, and then you have periods of reconvergence, and then you get a new cycle of expansion and reconvergence. And I'd argue that we are currently in the fourth cycle of expansion that is likely to reverse, if it is not already reversing, into a period of reconvergence. There are hallmarks of this of this pattern that are not entirely obvious. But let me go through and start to explain what these cycles are. In Muslim belief, the singularity with which Islam begins is God saying to Muhammad, recite. That all that Islam could be is encapsulated in that moment of theodicy where God speaks through the Prophet Muhammad, and it is comparatively undifferentiated. In other words, you cannot read the Quran predictively and say, oh, when I read the Quran I can see that there are going to be Sufi brotherhoods, or I can see that there's going to be a caliphate, or that there will be schools of law. You cannot read the Quran forward, but you can read all of Islamic history backward into the Quran. And people have. It's a very important aspect of Islamic religion, is that the Quran is continually there as the source, and everything can be read back into it. So there's your first singularity, but what is so striking is that seemingly almost immediately after the death of the Prophet and the end of the corpus of divine revelation, you get a phenomenal inflation, the coming into circulation of an enormous body of non-Quranic lore about what Islam is. That non-Quranic lore comes to take the form of what we call hadith, or ahadith in the plural. And it takes the form of stories about things that the Prophet Muhammad said or did at moments when he was not receiving revelation from God. The number of hadith that come into circulation apparently is in the hundreds of thousands. The content of the hadith is phenomenally diverse. Now, when you read about hadith, the main stuff you read about these days derives from a largely Western theory that hadith were invented out of whole cloth sometime around the late 700s, and that they do not actually reflect the words, the deeds, and deeds of Muhammad, except in a perhaps in a accidental coincidence. And I think that's wrong. I think that the Western studies of hadith have been essentially misguided in this respect. To say that everything that was later reported about the words and the deeds of Muhammad was invented more than a century after his death is to imply that the people who knew him didn't have anything to say about him after he died. Oh, Muhammad, well, him dead, so that's that. But everything we know about early Islam confirms the notion that Muhammad was a charismatic individual. He wasn't someone you forgot. His wife, for example, why would she have forgotten him instead of telling people about him? So my assumption is that the total corpus of hadith consists of things that are true, that do reflect the words and actions of the Prophet, and things that are not true. And that is the consensus of both of Muslim scholars, although not necessarily the consensus of Western scholars. the hadith are distributed irregularly across the Muslim world. In other words, the preponderance of the hadith that we know of today seem to have been circulated in Iraq, Iran, and Arabia, and scarcely at all, in any variety at least, in North Africa or Spain. But that variety, that heterogeneity, is even more pronounced when you look at local circumstances. You have a Muslim ruling elite in an empire, the population of which is almost entirely non-Muslim. So that you had groups of Muslims here and there, often separated by 50, 100 kilometers from the next group of Muslims. The hadith that were current in every group developed their own trajectory. So that what Islam was, say, in the city of Isfahan, was not the same thing as what Islam was in the city of Damascus, because they had different bodies of hadith. There was an assumption that you knew what was in the Quran, or that was knowable, and you knew things about the Prophet Muhammad, but what you knew about the Prophet Muhammad was uneven. This is the heterogeneity. So that what was happening was that from a singularity of all Islam in the theodicy of the Quran, you were moving toward a wide variety of Islams, so that the Islam in Tunisia would be different from the Islam in Central Asia or the Islam in Yemen. Now that didn't happen. It didn't happen because once the body of non-Quranic but prophetically authoritative lore reached a certain point, there were people in the Muslim community that said, this is not right. There should be some core that we can all agree on. And so you had a movement to collect and sift through and classify the hadith. And in that process, most of the hadith were discarded, but a core of several tens of thousands was retained. And it came to be embodied in 6 books that, well before the year 1000, these books have begun to gain credibility as being the canonical collections of hadith. So that is what Islam is. Now, this is a new singularity. In other words, at the beginning you have all the Islams are in the Quran. But by the time you begin to have the collection of hadith and the discarding of those hadith judged to be weak, you now have the notion that all Islam is present in the Quran and the Sunnah, because the hadith become the textual basis of the word Sunnah, which is the tradition of the community. So you essentially have a first explosive iteration of Islam, a huge variety, a great heterogeneity, and then a reconvergence in which some subset of this non-Quranic lore is taken to be true Islam. That, for some people, that was an extremely destructive experience. Because supposing you lived in a community that had in your lifetime, in the lifetime of the Muslims that you knew, had been fasting in the month of Sha'ban, as well as the month of Ramadan. And then you have, and you had all sorts of hadith confirming that Sha'ban, is a hypothetical example, that Sha'ban should be a month of fasting. And then you have scholars who collect hadith and say, all of those hadith that say you should fast during Sha'ban are false. So we'll reject them. Now your Islam is changing. And we have you can point to examples of how Islam came to be subjected to a strong normative framework through this process of the winnowing and canonization of a subset of hadith. In the process, it was very important that the geographical diversity of hadith be eliminated. So the hadith were all categorized by topic rather than by the location where they were collected. And yet we know that the process of collecting and winnowing the hadith involved a tremendous amount of travel by scholars. This is why we know about the degree of heterogeneity, because if all the hadith had started in one place, you simply go to that place and try and get it from the origin. But instead, people spent years, sometimes decades, traveling in order to find the most arcane hadith, get the largest collection of hadith they could have. Now, as that process proceeded, you look back at the hadith and you see this was a mechanism by which the beliefs and the traditions of non-Muslims entered Islam. And it is very striking. You look at individual hadith and you say, now, where did that come from? I mean, if you have a hadith that says that Muhammad prohibited the eating of onions and garlic, which was then discarded. It does not become an official hadith. And you say, well, how in the world did that arise? And of course it would arise when someone from a Hindu tradition that does prohibit onions and garlic, at least for certain castes, said, no, if I convert to Islam, do I continue to eat onions and garlic? Or do I start eating them, or do I stop eating them? And then there was an answer. Or you have a hadith where Aisha, the Prophet's wife, says, during my menstrual period, should I go and spend those days in a hut behind the house? And Muhammad says, no, you don't have to do that. Well, why would anyone have ever asked the question of Aisha, since that was not the custom in Arabia? Well, it's because Zoroastrians did spend those days in a hut behind the house. So some Zoroastrian wanted to know, in Islam, do I have to continue doing that? And the answer was no, and then all the women in Iran converted to Islam. So you can see mechanisms. And the Quran never names the wife of Adam when in talking about the creation of man and woman. She is simply the wife of Adam. But in Hadith, she is Eve. But where did that name come from? It wasn't in God's revelation of the Quran. It clearly comes from Jewish and Christian sources, and then it comes into Islam. The Hadith become a mechanism for adapting to other traditions in the vast area that the Islamic Empire had sway over. As the Hadith are closed down in this big crunch, you have a second cycle that begins, and that's in the area of law, where you have people saying law should be a part of Islam. This has to do with the growth in the percentage of the population that was Muslim. At the very beginning, when Muslims were almost all members of Arab tribes, the customary law of the Arab tribe was the dominant form of law, and it was passed on among tribal sheikhs and so forth. But as you had people coming into Islam from Zoroastrian, Christian, Jewish, and other communities that had legal systems, they'd say, what is the Islamic law on such and such? And people began to think about what is Islamic law. As they did so with very diverse techniques and with very diverse conclusions. And so you had a plurality of concepts of what is Islamic law and how is Islamic law to be formed and applied. Each concept is called a madhab, which means a place from going forth. We often call it a school, but that implies a greater degree of institutionalization than ever existed in the early centuries. The founders of these schools lived in the early Abbasid period of the late 8th and early 9th century, but in fact, law doesn't become the sort of obsessive interest of the educated Muslims until the 900s. And you can see this when you look at the biographical dictionaries. You simply say, well, what proportion of the noteworthy Muslims were devoting their careers to the study and the elaboration of the law, and they have the word faqih, meaning someone who's a student of jurisprudence. And prior to the year 900, you have a comparatively small number of people who are called faqih. And then in the 900s, faqih becomes the standard. And you develop a society that is quite consumed on matters relating to law. Now that is, in the 900s, this is after the main collections of hadith are now closed. In other words, the diversity of hadith is coming to an end as the diversity of law is gaining force, and hadith play a role in the law, but it's a role that people disagree about. One madhab will say we must follow hadith as a legal basis, and another will say we should never follow hadith as a legal basis. One school will say we must use analogy, so that if the Quran says do not drink grape wine lest you be drunk when you go to prayers, one school will say, well, if you can't drink grape wine, that means that you cannot use intoxicants, and therefore it'd be wrong to drink coffee. I mean, that's a later on development. Or it'd be wrong to drink other forms of alcohol. But then some legal scholars would say, no, it's just wrong to drink grape wine. The Quran says nothing about whiskey or bira or vodka, or, so you can drink those because God didn't prohibit those. And someone else will say, well, no, you can drink anything you want as long as you're not drunk at prayers, because after all, the Quran gives the reason for not drinking. So you end up with varieties of legal thought that range from minimalist to maximalist, and they also offer points of entry for ways of thinking that do not originate within the Muslim religious canon of Quran and Hadith. And these ways of thinking very often are coming from the legal and philosophical traditions of the non-Muslim communities. In other words, if you have a Jewish lawyer who comes into Islam, does he bring it with him the whole corpus of Jewish law and simply relabel it Islamic law? That might seem far-fetched, but in fact, a number of very important Western scholars have argued exactly that Jewish law is engrossed in certain areas into Islamic law in a very deep and pervasive fashion. One example that one of my students worked on had to do with the law in Islam regarding washing before prayer. He said that in Islamic law, if you have a basin of water and a pig is drinking from it, that you cannot then do your ablutions using that water. You have to throw that water out. If you see a dog drinking out of the basin, then you have to throw the water out and destroy the basin, because that water has been polluted by the saliva of these animals. And you have many, many very notable scholars who said Islamic law is exactly like Jewish law in its attitude toward the pollution that you have from pigs. But as my student pointed out in his doctoral thesis, he said that as an Orthodox Jew, I can French kiss a pig and immediately say my prayers. Because he says, because pig saliva does not pollute in Jewish law. I can't eat the pig, but I can embrace the pig. I think this is the only doctoral thesis that will ever be written that uses the image of French kissing a pig. And he brought up another number of other examples. He said, now the fact of the matter is that Jewish law on purity and ablutions is entirely different from Muslim law. And yet scholars, particularly Western scholars, have said, no, they're the same thing. He says the reason is that they don't actually know Jewish law, and they just make an inference. So you have a huge variety that comes into law. Now that variety is parallel in terms of it being a mechanism for other traditions to enter Islam. And yet it also has an impact of violent contestation. So that people who believed in one law school came to the point increasingly in the 1000s and the 1100s of killing one another because of disagreements on law. And I'm not talking here about Shiites and Sunnis. I'm talking here about Sunnis killing one another. The city I did my doctoral dissertation on, the city of Nishapur, at the end of the first third of the 1100s, encountered a civil war within the city between Shafis and Hanafis. And people who belonged to one law school would set up catapults and bombard the mosques and the madrasas in the nearby neighborhoods. And the second largest city in Islam destroyed itself through internal fighting, and the city was abandoned and rebuilt some distance away because the Hanafis and the Shafis hated each other so much. And yet if you read any book on Islamic law, it will say the four Sunni law schools mutually accept one another as being orthodox, and they have no profound disagreement. That is not a historical fact going back to the early period of the law, but it represents the reconvergence that occurred when the infighting, the fanatic warfare between law schools reached such a destructive point that you had people who decided, no, we have to get rid of the extremes and reconverge on something. So that by the end of the 1100s, for the first time you have a college set up that teaches 4 law schools, has one wing for each law school. These are people who, a century earlier, if they'd had 4 in the same place, they would have been fighting in student riots every day. But that was sort of the beginning of the discarding of most of the law schools and the reconvergence on the idea that there are 4 Sunni law schools and more than one Shiite law school, but 4 Sunni law schools that are equally important. And the period of fighting was superseded by a period of mutual tolerance. That is the second big crunch. From that time onward, everything that Islam could be is conceptualized as the Quran, Sunnah, and Sharia. There's no Sharia in the Quran, just in the Quran. There's no Sharia in the corpus of Hadith, self-declared at least, although that becomes a source for Sharia. But the idea that law is definitive in terms of who a Muslim is, that becomes the product of this second big crunch. This ignores the fact, of course, that many, perhaps most Muslims, had no idea what the Sharia was, were living in villages and tribes and had no access to the legal system. This was a conceptual big crunch carried out by scholars. Now let me point out that the canonization of the Hadith and the reduction of the disagreement of the law schools, neither of these are related to the Islamic State. They weren't done by the caliphs or their agents. they are being done by actors in the Muslim community who do not hold official posts. It's this extraordinary thing about the Muslim community is that the most important actors in the religious evolution are not servants of the state, nor are they servants of the church, because there is no church. So it's a community that from the very beginning is developing internal tendencies of thought, reflection, and religious development that are not paralleled by the history of the state or by the institutional history of mosques, courts, etc. Okay, by 1200, this is sort of a done deal. The 4 law schools are mutually tolerant. You have a new singularity. Then you have a new inflation. And this is the inflation of the spread of the Sufi brotherhoods. The Sufi brotherhoods become the primary form of Muslim religious expression from the 1200s onward to say early 1800s. The variety of the Sufi brotherhoods is staggering. They're usually referred to as Islamic mysticism, and historians of Sufism usually ignore the later period of the brotherhoods and focus on the earlier periods where you have a handful of spiritual athletes who have moments of poetic utterance or miraculous behavior or something, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about Sufi brotherhoods as organized religious observance within Islam, but organized outside the context of the 5 pillars of Islam. In other words, the Sufi brotherhoods don't relate to daily prayer, they don't relate to the fasting of Ramadan, they don't relate to the giving of alms. They do incorporate the Shahada, the profession of faith. They do recognize the pilgrimage, although for many Sufis, making a pilgrimage to the tomb of the Sufi founder is more important than going to Mecca. So this is, in a sense, supererogatory personal devotion. But by the year 1400, it's likely that every male adult living in a substantial Muslim city belonged to at least one Sufi brotherhood. Now, there are those who, by belong, I make a differentiation. You have those people who were Sufis, who submitted themselves to the rules for a Sufi that were specific to each brotherhood, and participated in the rituals and in the group meetings of the brotherhoods. But you had others who wanted to be known as the kind of person who hangs around with the Sufis. There were Sufi wannabes, and they outnumbered the Sufis themselves. And in some cases, particularly in the manual for Sufis of As-Suhrawardi, he has a whole list of rules for a Sufi, and then he has another set of rules for people who are Sufi wannabes, saying that if you're a Sufi, you cannot laugh at a joke. If you are a wannabe, you can't laugh at a joke if the joke violates Islamic law. But if it's really funny, and it doesn't offend Islamic law, then you can laugh at it. If you're a Sufi, you cannot disparage someone by saying that his father is a dog. But if you are a Sufi wannabe, and if the person is so insolent that you just can't restrain yourself, then you can say your father is a dog. But the point of this is that the aura of Sufism went beyond the community itself. The first Sufi brotherhoods expand in the 1200s, and they number in the thousands. They spread all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And they are dramatically understudied, but they become the mechanisms by which Islam, in a dramatic new period of expansion after the year 1200, they become the mechanisms by which Islam incorporates or adapts or finds a common ground with non-Muslim customs and traditions in new parts of the world. In other words, they're doing what the Hadith did originally. They're providing mechanisms for other ideas to enter Islam. In the 19th century, the more sober, scholarly core of the Islamic world, particularly the Sunni world, but Shiite as well, decided that the brotherhoods were too diverse, too superstitious, too extravagant in spiritual ways, and that had to be cut back. This was something that European imperialists agreed with entirely, because they had found that Sufi brotherhoods formed the core of resistance to imperialist expansion. So they were happy to find legal scholars who would say, let's get rid of the Sufis, because the Sufis were causing them a huge headache by carrying on guerrilla warfare in Morocco or in Indonesia or places like that. The result is that in the course of the 19th century, most of the Sufi brotherhoods disappear, and by the late 20th century, there are a few Sufi brotherhoods, but not many. So you've had the third wave of expansion, and then you have a third big crunch. But what it was left with was that by the middle of the 20th century, you have the increasingly the notion that what Islam is Quran, Sunnah, Sharia, and Jama'ah, the community, the group. Muslims prior to the 13th century didn't belong to groups. The brotherhoods were very different, say, from the legal schools. The brotherhoods had membership, they had hierarchy, they had rules. The law schools were notional, and you didn't have a formal hierarchy, you didn't have formal membership, so forth. So the notion that you observed Islam through your group is the takeaway. So the mysticism is not the takeaway. In other words, the Muslim Brotherhood is a product of this third wave of expansion or inflation, even though it is not mystic, because the mysticism is sort of epiphenomenal with respect to the Sufi brotherhoods. So whether it is the Muslim Brotherhood or Al-Qaeda or the Tabligh, the world's largest Muslim sect, or the movement of Fethullah Gulen, Sufi orders like the Naqshbandis and the Qadris. The tendency today is that for many Muslims, expressing Islam through a group is considered normative. Not for all, but for many. But then all of them weren't legalists, all of them were not Hadith scholars either. This reconvergence, while playing into the interests of international actors and state actors, was not, for the most part, carried out by the state, although certain states did try and suppress Sufism. Now, the fourth area I won't go into extensively, except it begins in the late 19th century, and it is triggered by the spread into the Muslim religious community of printing, and particularly of lithographic printing. Prior to 1900, in order to become a learned Muslim, you studied with a sheikh. You were in a classroom, or if you were Sufi, you studied with your murshid. You learned face to face. Learning by reading existed, but it didn't have the same sort of cachet as learning by personal discipleship. With the spread of printing, increasingly Muslims turn to authors rather than living authorities. The first Muslim newspaper, Al-Urwat al-Wuthqa, in 1880, and new ideas. The first important Muslim magazine, Al-Manar, from Cairo, the same thing. It's associated with Muslim modernism. But the printing, while originally serving as a vehicle for scholars, becomes increasingly a vehicle for people who want to shoot their mouth off about Islam. And audio tapes and videotapes and radio and television become the successors. In other words, you have this fourth expansion of Islam is essentially a media expansion that changes the nature of authority. A few weeks after 9/11, Time magazine decided that, as they occasionally decide and then don't seem to remember, they decided they knew nothing about Islam, which was true. That's a constant. So they decided they'd have an afternoon where all the editors of Time would get together with some specialists to get briefed on what Islam was. So 5 people were invited, or I don't know how many were invited. 5 of us actually came. I was the only non-Muslim in the group. But you had Tariq Ramadan from Switzerland. You had a Saudi from the DC area, an Indian from Michigan, and a Palestinian from England. At one point, it was a pretty dull afternoon. But at one point, since I didn't question, I raised a question to my colleagues: where does authority lie among Muslims today? And the Saudi said authority resides in the declarations, the statements of the duly appointed muftis and qadis that you have in every country. Then we went through 2 more, and we finally got to the Palestinian from England. He said, authority resides with the man whom the shabab, the youth in the street, regard as the person expressing their interests or their beliefs. So you had essentially the full spectrum, from Saudi conservatism to Hamas street radicalism, represented here in just four Muslim voices. Because the media explosion made it possible for every Muslim, particularly in the Sunni world — the Shiites have a little discipline, for heaven's sake, but Sunnis do not — every Muslim comes to think that he or she can say, I know what Islam is, I had a bad marriage, and therefore Islam must be terrible. Or, I grew up in such and such a family, and that must be what Islam is. The result is that today there are efforts abroad to try to rein this in, to bring back a new convergence, to find some way of saying, what is the center of Sunni Islam? Where is authority in Sunni Islam? The organization of the Islamic Conference is embarked on this. Saudi King Abdullah is embarked on this. A number of the former Crown Prince Hassan in Jordan. But how to do it? How to do it is a mystery. New conversions coming. Now, there are 2 takeaways from this. Take the watch off and then look at my wrist. 2 takeaways from this. The first takeaway is that when you look at the history of Islam in an integrated fashion, whether you adopt a Big Crunch hypothesis or not, but when you integrate the entire history of Islam, you find that certain topics, certain phenomena are important at different times and then have a residual effect. You study hadith, you study law, you study modern movements. It's important to try and create an integrated history. It's difficult to do, but mine is not the only possible approach. Another takeaway for me is that the 13th century is the most crucial period of Islamic history after the life of the Prophet. That is when you had the beginning of the Sufi Turk, and you also have a tremendous change in the nature of the Muslim state at that time, because the caliphate disappears. Yesterday I talked about the consequences of this in the shift of the center of Islamic world feeling from the caliphate to the pilgrimage to Mecca. And the supervision of the pilgrimage supplanting the caliphate as the political expression of the center of Islam, which today redounds as official title the servitor of the two holy places, the Khadim al-Haramain. But I'm long out of time, and I know many of you have a class to go to very soon, so I'm going to stop here and entertain any questions or comments you might care to have. Thank you very much. This is very singularly an Islamic phenomenon, the Big Bang, Big Crunch. In other words, when you look at the history of Christianity or Buddhism, the biggest competitors, when they split, they stop talking to each other, or they regard each other as cousins, but they don't come back together again. You don't have Theravada Buddhists and Zen Buddhists, getting together and saying, "Oh, we're all Buddhists, we're all together." You just have a spread. The same thing with Christianity. Christianity splits again and again and again, and while they sometimes quit killing each other, they never really come back together, so that this Muslim phenomenon of reconvergence is very peculiar to Islam, and it's particularly surprising because it's not state-driven, nor is it institutionally driven, but it's driven by frankly, by factors in the community that I find it very hard to analyze. The people who are instrumental in reconvergence tend to be sort of the self-appointed Islamic scholarly community. And that's unusual because they don't have an institutional base. Now, the question of the time periods, I think that that there is a relationship to Islam experiencing contact with non-Muslim cultural influences. In other words, in the initial conquests, Muslims from Arabia come into contact with non-Muslims in many different regions, and the Hadith become a vehicle for facilitating some sort of adaptation. As the literate or the educated elements in these non-Muslim communities convert to Islam, then you get the legal interface with the non-Muslim legal traditions and philosophical traditions. And that really is a function of the rate of conversion and the movement from having sort of sub-elite conversion to having elite conversion. The phenomenon of the Sufi brotherhoods, Sufis around almost from the beginning, but the brotherhoods are of the 13th century. And there's a great question that I haven't satisfied myself on as to the degree to which the deterioration of the living conditions in the Muslim world, and including the Mongol conquest, catalyzed this movement. I published a book last summer entitled Cotton, Climate, and Conversion, Cotton, Climate, and Camels in Early Islamic Iran. And one of the topics of that book was the climate change that seems to have afflicted Iraq and Iran, the most dynamic centers of the early Muslim world, starting in the first decade of the 1000s. For the next 125 years or so, it was uncommonly cold in the eastern part of the Middle East. This greatly affected the agricultural output, so you ended up with disease, famine, civil disorder as people were competing for a sharply reduced supply of goods. It facilitated the conversion of large areas from cropland into pasture land because they were not producing well, and so it coincides with the coming of the Turks into the area. And it also coincides with a very substantial migration of Iranians out of Iran. So the first time, I mean, Iran had been around as an imperial power since 500 BC, but the Persian language had never spread. Now, for the first time, in the 1100s, the Persian language spreads because Iranians leave Iran and go to India, to Syria, Iraq, to Anatolia, to Central Asia, to get away from the incredible deterioration of life in Iran. And the Sufi traditions, many of them are substantially based in Iran, and they spread through this diaspora to some degree. So when you look, for example, at Rumi, the greatest of the Sufi poets, perhaps, who's writing in Persian but not living in Iran. There is no earlier Persian poet living west of Iran who is of importance. And at the same time, you have a parallel in India. Poets writing in Persian for the first time, and many of these are Sufis. So there you may have exogenous impacts, but then you have also the factor of the 13th century is when you have the first Muslim community described for Indonesia, the Mali Empire beginning in the Sudan, the western Sudan area, the expansion of Islam into Sudan, the country of Sudan after 600 years of a stable border and so forth. So it's a complex question, but I think these cycles are not automatic, but rather they are related to things that are happening in the Muslim community, and they are facilitating Islam's convergence with non-Muslim traditions throughout the area to which Islam expands. That has not been done. When you look at Islamic studies over the last 200 years, you find a tremendous amount of effort has gone into law. And a substantial effort, particularly in the mid to late 20th century, has gone into hadith. Virtually no effort has gone into Sufi brotherhoods, although that is now becoming a major area. So that's your link to the modern world that is missing from the scholarship. And when it comes to the modern world, particularly the United States, from the end of World War II down to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, there was a total of, I believe, 3 books by American-trained scholars dealing with contemporary Islam. What means that while Sayyid Qutb was writing, and Ayatollah Khomeini and so on, American scholars were not reading this material, even though it was being eaten up by Muslims in the area. And so there you have a problem that contemporary Islam, which is now a very hot issue, was ignored by Western scholars. Integrated history of Islam as a faith community. It has to be integrated geographically, so we can account for all the portions. It has to be integrated topically, so we don't leave out the most important things of the post-13th century, the Sufi brotherhoods. And it has to be integrated methodologically, so that we don't say that, books of jurisprudence are important, but books of another sort are unimportant. So we have a huge gaps in our understanding of this history, and if you don't have a comprehensible, integrated, and workable history of the Muslim Ummah over 14 centuries, you can't really do the history of the politics in a very convincing fashion, because the politics don't run things, but they are affected by things that happen. Well, look, you have two confrontations. You have a confrontation with non-Muslims, particularly with Americans and Europeans, and you have a confrontation within Ummah with governments that are unsympathetic to Islam. There's a if you look at Islamic political theory, you find that around the time of the Mongols, you had a consensus reached that anarchy is the worst possible state, and that therefore you must have a government. That government, however, very Hobbesian concept, it was assumed that that government tends toward tyranny, and that therefore you have a problem, that you can't have no government, but government tends toward tyranny. So therefore you have to put constraints on government. And the Muslim political theory conceptualized Islamic law as the constraint on tyranny. In the same way that Western thinkers came to think of the vox populi, the voice of the people, as a constraint on tyranny. Because after the Peace of Westphalia, the notion of Christian law disappears. This is a theoretical construct. Most of the governments remained despotic, but their despotism tended to be focused on the ruling family. But for most ordinary citizens, Islamic law actually seemed to work. All studies done of the Ottoman legal system indicate that the population of the Ottoman Empire, and we have to assume the same thing has a parallel in the Safavid world, the population of the Ottoman Empire thought that they were getting justice from the religious courts. Even if they were non-Muslims, they felt that this was just. Now, the fact that the Sultan might decapitate his wife and dump her body in the Bosphorus, that was an embarrassment, perhaps, but it didn't affect the basic legitimacy of the courts. Monica Lewinsky off the Oval Office, it doesn't discredit the court system. And I think we've assumed that despotic behavior by rulers represents a articulated despotism that goes through the entire society, and it doesn't. It's bad behavior at the top. But by and large, the court systems worked. So then when you get to so-called westernization or modernization, with the Tanzimat and Muhammad Ali and so forth, that general story we have in modern Middle Eastern history, the Islamic court system is dismantled to a large extent. The Islamic educational system is dismantled or minimized. And what should have happened in terms of Muslim political, as the Sharia marginalized, the conceptual limitation on tyranny is being eroded. So what should have happened is that as Islam is pushed away from a public role and a governing influence, you should have had an increase in tyranny. What you actually got, at least in the Middle East, was a dramatic increase in tyranny. In other words, the theory was completely predictive. That by the 1950s, the world's largest agglomeration of authoritarian regimes who made a very, very, very strong point of being secular, because they knew that their opposition was primarily conceivably religious. Now, because of this political theory, there was a sort of inchoate, but nevertheless effective mental, worldview in Muslim societies that when the government is really, really bad, religion should provide redress against tyranny. So what should have happened in the 1960s and 70s, you should have had a growth of Islamic politics and movements to try to curb the tyranny of the state. What actually happened? That's exactly what happened. It had nothing to do with Israel, nothing to do with America or Britain or something like that. It was just basically people saying, our governments are terrible and religion should help us out of this. So in my view, the structure of Islamic political thought has been the driving force over the last couple of hundred years in terms of the ebb and flow of power, and that the only way that you're going to get past the current era of neo-Mamluk tyranny is to find a modus vivendi with Islamic politics. That is, you know, I know that the proper American thing to do is to say, well, let's wait until you have civil society and private enterprise producing a social movement of moderates who will generate a demand for true democracy, and that is considered a good idea now. So, you know, Fareed Zakaria will talk about that. But that's been the good Western idea ever since the 1950s. This is modernization theory. Don't expect democracy until everybody is already American. It doesn't work that way. If you are going to erode the power of the tyrannical state, it is going to be through Islamic politics, not exclusively, but, you know, playing a major role, and that is going to take place probably through electoral reform or electoral achievement, rather than violent means, which basically you normally do not succeed. So on that basis, I became quite a fan of the revolution in Iran, and I still look upon the Islamic Republic of Iran as the most interesting experiment in politics of the last 50 years. Absolutely fascinating what has happened and what probably is going to be happening in future years. And in some ways, Iran created and destroyed the idea of the Islamic Republic. It created the idea because it was something exciting and new and maybe it would work, and then it didn't work. So now it's discredited. Several years ago, I was the co-organizer of a conference for Muslim political activists and members of electoral commissions throughout the Muslim world to meet in Amman and to talk about elections and constitutions. I had set up the agenda so that there was one session to talk about the idea of an Islamic Republic. And absolutely nobody wanted to talk about the subject. Nobody, and these are mostly Sunnis, but we had people like Ayatollah Khedivar there, some Iranians. Nobody thought that the Islamic Republic was a viable rubric at that point. This was like 6 years ago. The rubric that I had not put on, that everybody wanted to talk about, was pluralism. That had become the buzzword in Islamic political circles. And it was interesting. There were some leading members of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood there, and someone asked the question, well, what do you think of Sayyid Qutb, who of course is a revolutionary writer in the tradition of the Brotherhood? And he said, well, we recognize that Sayyid Qutb is a member of the Brotherhood, but we don't agree with his ideas. We don't take him as one of our leading thinkers. The person who we think is really a model to think about is Sheikh Fadlallah of Lebanon. I thought, Fadlallah is a Shiite. And here you have a Sunni political activist group saying they disowning their most famous writer of the post-war era, and saying that they should follow Sheikh Fadlallah. Well, what was it about Sheikh Fadlallah? And they said, well, he doesn't want an Islamic republic, but he wants a pluralistic regime in which if Muslims are elected, they rule until the electorate finds that they are not fit to rule, in which case they may be replaced by other people who are not Muslims. Now, were they trying to sell that to the crypto CIA agents in the room? I don't think so, because there weren't any there. I think that they were trying to sell it to fellow Sunnis. And the Islamism, I know Europeans like the phrase post-Islamist, which I don't agree with, but the notion of Islam as a governing doctrine in a modern nation-state context is not simply a fixed thing. It is an evolving ideology that reflects changes that are occurring in the Muslim world and in the world at large, including, in this case, in Iran. But I think that in the long run, it's going to be through the achievement of Muslim political movements, of a workable modus vivendi with other political forces in an electoral regime, that is going to be the way out. In which case, the most important country, in my view today, is Turkey, where you have a classic neo-Mamluk regime, military dictatorship, has finally seemingly met its match in a very, very skillfully moderate Islamic party governing. And if there is a coup in Turkey tomorrow in which the army says enough is enough, we're going to take over, then everything I say can be canceled. But so far, it is going in an encouraging fashion. More encouraging, I think, than what's happening in Malaysia, though Malaysia is a interesting, and Indonesia, they're interesting examples as well. But I think that Islamic politics, as opposed to the spread of Western civil society, I think Islamic politics is the way out in the future, but it has to be an Islamic politics that learns, perhaps iteratively through perhaps bitter experiences, that they can't have the whole loaf, that they can only succeed if they recognize the nature of electoral politics and they accept the need for compromise and pluralistic participation. So that's my hope.
Thank you very much.